Hey folks, I'm presenting on Module 4B on colonialism and decolonial thought. The first text that's a part of the module is the chapter on violence from Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And Fanon in that chapter focuses on colonial oppression and violence. He argues that colonialism is inherently violent, with the colonized subjected to various forms of physical, psychological, and structural violence by the colonizers. He advocates that for the necessary that counterviolence is necessary. Fanon contends that in response to colonial violence, the colonized must use counterviolence as a means of self-defense and resistance. He sees violence as a tool to reclaim agency and dignity. He's also interested in psychological liberation as well. So violence for Fanon is not just about physical resistance, but also about psychological liberation. He believes that engaging in violence can help break the psychological chains of colonial oppression and instill a sense of empowerment and identity among the colonized. He also suggests that violence has transformative potential, both for the individual engaged in it and for society as a whole. Through violent struggle, the colonized can reshape power dynamics and challenge colonial structures. The second text, so this is a quote from On Violence. I'm going to have the example follow the summary just for continuity's sake. So here's a quote that captures like sort of the main premise of his piece. The uprising of the new nation and the breaking down of the colonial structures, the result of one of two causes, either of a violent struggle of the people in their own right, or of action on the part of surrounding colonized peoples, which acts as a brake on the colonial regime in question. The second text in the module is Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. They argue that in here that decolonization, well, they point to a kind of the phenomenon of this overuse of decolonization as sort of a catch-all for any sort of social justice movement towards liberation. And so they want they're very clear that they want it used in a specific way, or that it should be used in a specific way. That it's, entails sort of a doing, a process, a project, and that to the metaphorization of it hollows it out in a way that renders it inauthentic. So they are critical of sort of critical approaches that do not in the process of decolonization, do not center indigeneity and efforts to return land to indigenous peoples. So similar to what now, of course, we have is the hashtag land back efforts. So here's a quote that sort of captures their concern regarding the metaphysization of decolonization, and that it makes possible a set of evasions of settler moves to innocence that problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. So it's sort of this way of like, if they talk, what I hear them saying here, and I witnessed this, is this tossing around of decolonization by settlers in a way where it's sort of to assuage their own guilt, right? Make them feel better, like they're doing something. And to me, it sort of rings true when we start talking about things like performative activism. The next text that we looked at is Bonfil Batalla, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, Mexico Profundo. It's a seminal work in Chicana studies that explores the complex cultural and historical layers of Mexico. Taya argues that Mexico's indigenous roots, traditions, and worldview, referred to as Mexico Profundo or Deep Mexico, persist beneath the surface of modern westernized Mexican society. So he emphasizes the importance of recognizing and valuing this deep cultural heritage, which he sees as integral to understanding Mexico's identity and addressing its social and political challenges. Battaglia critiques the dominance of Western modernity and calls for a reclamation of indigenous values and knowledge as a means of fostering social harmony and sustainable development. He provides examples and counterexamples in his text, one of which I actually will return to when I am evaluating in the evaluation portion. Here's a quote that I felt really captured his argument. The absence of an Indian ethnic identity has much more profound significance because it reveals that a mechanism of identification has been broken. And I hear this quote as speaking to the argument he's making, but also with its relationship to colonialism, and how specifically he views sort of one of the acts of colonialism as the de-Indianing of a people as opposed to just acculturation. So in other words, the intentional effort to erase one's culture, in this case, the culture, Indian culture of the Mesoamericans in Latin America. The next text is Quijano's Coloniality and Modernity, Rationality, excuse me. So Quijano echoes a lot of what we read in the earlier readings regarding colonization and what manifests as colonization. One of the things that I appreciated about Quijano's article, and granted, of course, this is the order in which we read them. So I read it as adding to this discussion of colonization and its impact on Chicanx peoples, this process of violently concentrating the world's resources under the control and for the benefit of a small European minority. So this hoarding of resources, which is a very particularly colonial move that, of course, we see manifest in all sorts of different ways today. However, it ties into a move towards all sorts of things as being deemed property. And of course, Quijano does talk about this. One thing in particular, although he doesn't explicitly say that knowledge, actually, yeah, he does say knowledge is property. Knowledge comes to be known as property. So that knowledge does become to be known as property, but although he doesn't explicitly couple that with this statement of the world's resources being violently concentrated to the benefit of very few people, I do read it as that, right? And we see that when we see one of the violences enacted through colonization of a hierarchy of knowledge being produced, and who counts as knowledgeable and who holds the knowledge and what counts as knowledge. Here is also another a quote that I think picks up on another aspect that's important from Quijano's article, that coloniality of power is based upon racial social classification of the world population under Eurocentric power. So he also brings into this discussion, he doesn't introduce it if we're looking at these texts as being in conversation with each other, but he does touch upon, as of course the other authors do, race as being invented and then used as a social construct and used as a way to categorize the colonized and the colonizers, right? So, and as a justification for colonization as well. The next article that we read is The Mestizo Concept by Dr. Jack D. Forbes. And Forbes analyzes the term mestizo, which he, in his argument, reads as primarily a derogatory term that he argues is frequently misapplied to Mexicans and Chicanos. So I was about to applaud his argument, but I need to say that for a different part. So in both racial cultural sense, though, he argues that the Spaniard is profoundly mestizo. And this, he argues, can also be said of Europeans, such as the English, Scottish, Russian, and of course, other nations. But I think he even argues more that they are probably more mixed, right? If we're thinking about it in terms of sort of the mestizo or mestizo and not much like a continuity of culture, more so than the Mexicans and Chicanos. But he says, they're not questioned, right? It's just assumed that they hold this sort of esteemed level of privilege and power and are pure. So he would like to see the word mestizo sort of fade out of use and not be used anymore, which I think is interesting, given that we know that that hasn't been the case. So more on that later. So this ties into the part in his article where he identifies sort of who is subject to this questioning and who is not. Such questions about, the identity and the mixed nature, say, of a person, those are only asked of knockdown, conquered, colonized, and powerless people. So that questioning is a tool of the colonizer, in other words. The next article that we read was by Perez, but I'm actually going to skip ahead. I want to start with Sexing the Colonial Imaginary, because I see the decolonial border queers as an extension of Perez Sexing the Colonial Imaginary. So in the book, The Decolonial Imaginary, Chapter 1 is Sexing the Colonial Imaginary, and it is a feminist intervention into the study of Chicano, Chicanx historiographies, and restoring to the history women's lived experiences. So in Sexing the Colonial Imaginary, Perez argues that Chicanas should be the foregrounds Chicanas, and they remove them from sort of this secondary or just as a backdrop to men's activities. Like they're on the periphery. They're there, they have experiences, but they're always in relationship to men, people of power, colonizers, etc. So for Perez, the women's voices and actions intervene to do what she calls sexing the colonial imaginary and historically tracking women's agency onto the colonial landscape. So we can, gosh, I lost my train of thought. So to Chicana studies, then she's bringing themes of gender and also foregrounding women's lived experiences. Quote, women's voices and actions, this is what I read already. So again, historically tracking women's agency onto the colonial landscape, but in a way that it doesn't discuss it always in relationship to the colonized or in relationship to men. So returning then to decolonial border queers, I think, we can see sex in the colonial imaginary at work here in this article. So in this, Perez explores the intersections of queerness and borderland identities there at the US-Mexican border. Again, looking at that place, that intersection, the border as a liminal space. And so this is those interstitial spaces, those sort of the third spaces that she talks about in Sexing the Colonial Imaginary. This would be an example of that, right? So she's staying within that space and analyzing it and arguing that those spaces are both sites of oppression and resistance, where queer people develop unique forms of self-expression and community building. Her lens that she applies in here certainly is intersectional, and she also, of course, employs firsthand accounts and lived experiences as not only legitimate forms of knowledge, but primary forms of knowledge. Here's a quote that exemplifies sort of the main takeaway or argument of her article. Border queers are always already negotiating between a colonial burden and their decolonial practices. So you can read in that its contribution to colonial thought or decolonial thought, but also get a feel for sort of that negotiation and those interstitial spaces that she talks about in Sexing the Colonial Imaginary. Okay, so considering each article in turn. So with Fanon, I appreciated that he interrogates the relationship between colonization and violence, both in terms of the violence enacted by the colonizer, but also that it is at times necessary for the colonized to engage in an uprising. And we, of course, we have seen this throughout history, and in our contemporary society, like in Palestine, for example, which I think makes Fanon's on violence, it gives it this timeless appeal. One question I have is regarding his world divided in two, perhaps being overly simplistic. Again, given or because he also talks about there being sort of this well, potentially like a third category, right? So the intellectual, the colonized intellectual, right? So I like to think that that's when he refers to zombies in his article, that's what who he's referring to, are the colonized people who sort of like, well, drank the Kool-Aid, if you will, of colonization and are sort of in like the zombie mode where they're performing the colonizer role, but they are still the colonized. And I guess that's where I sort of see the world divided in two, perhaps challenged or a further divide. Tuck and Wayne, I think that this article is incredibly important, and again, has a bit of a timeless appeal to it as well, because man, so especially I'm an educator, and in education, secondary education, the word decolonization is getting thrown around. I mean, it's definitely being employed as a metaphor more than it is being employed as an action, right? And that is 100%, in my view, not what it's intended to, what it's intended to do. So I appreciate this article, and I've shared it with my colleagues, and I find the article convincing. The question remains, must decolonization involve the return of land? And I think that they make a good point when they say decolonization can start with decolonization of the mind, but it can't stop there. And I do agree with them. I don't necessarily agree that it always must result or end with, like, it's never with the return of the land, but I do agree with them that it needs to center indigeneity. And I found this particularly insightful when thinking about occupations and armed occupations. So for example, here in Seattle, we have had Indigenous occupations, and we have had not Indigenous occupations, right? So for El Centro de la Raza here in Seattle was taken by an occupation by Chicanos who wanted to have an adult education and cultural center. And they got keys for a old school building in Seattle schools that wasn't being used anymore. And they occupied it and said, it's ours now. And they've been there ever since. But Tuck and Gang make a fabulous point when they say that's all great. However, it's still happening on Indigenous land. And I think that is so brilliant. It doesn't necessarily negate the effort of El Centro de la Raza, but it does it does recenter sort of indigeneity and return to the land in a way that redirects our focus towards its original stewards. Bonefield Bataya, I really appreciate that he draws attention to the unfortunate schism between indigeneity and Mexican people in Mexico. And I know that that is actually something that benefits the colonizer, which he argues, in terms of it removes sort of in this ideological, figurative and literal way, land rights that Mexican people would have to that land, right? Like they're indigenous to those regions of Mexico. And as someone who has grown up in Seattle and grown up in the US and always, Mexico is this other country with, up until I would say, as an adult, I never viewed Mexican people as indigenous peoples, right? Like the whole Mesoamerican history, it just wasn't a thing. Or like the Aztecs, they're all dead. It's a thing of the past. They're relics, and they are not connected in any way, shape, or form to Mexicans, which of course, that's the schism, right? So I really appreciate that he argues that we need to heal that schism. That schism needs to be healed. I do question if museums and murals, particularly murals, still have, quote, no real connection with our contemporary reality and collective future by our Chicanos, not me as white woman here in Seattle. And I think that there are some murals that would push back on that statement. I think, for example, of murals that are in Chicano Park, for example, and I show a couple on my last or second to last slide, perhaps. So that is a question that I had leaving that article. Quijano, so again, returning to the summary, I appreciate the addition of colonization and as like the hoarding of resources. I think that has a contemporary appeal today, especially. I do question his claim that Latin America is without a doubt the most extreme case of cultural colonization by Europe. I mean, again, I can understand he's speaking from his perspective and with a particular history in mind. But I would imagine if you asked Fanon, for example, right, whose experience was very much grounded in his own experiences in the African diaspora, there are probably scholars and African descendants who would argue, oh, actually, Latin America is without the most, or Africa is without a doubt the most extreme. So that's just something that I globbed onto as potentially something to dig further into. Forbes, I appreciated the depiction of colonial hypocrisy that he effectively calls out in his article. And although it's something that I was like generally familiar with, I'd never thought about it in that way. And I think it was brilliant. I do think the question remains, and I think we have some answers to this question. Can Chicano or Chicana, Chicanx, Chicane be reclaimed, reimagined, empowered? And then Perez. So foregrounds Chicana's perspectives. I think that is incredibly powerful. Sort of, again, the sex scene of the colonial imaginary. So not looking at Chicana gendered experiences, not solely in relationship to the colonized and to men. And she provides a great framework, of course, for contending with border queers, which we see, but also for reading, all sorts of Chicana cultural productions, experiences, etc. Okay. So to the field in general, this selection of readings, it added complexities and nuances of colonization for Chicanas, Chicano, Chicanxes, to the field, and as well as transnationally. They provide frameworks for analysis of Chicana identities, cultural productions, et cetera. Again, thinking about Perez and the sexing of the colonial imaginary and this third space feminism. There's a focus on indigeneity that is certainly incredibly important too when we talk about colonialism and decolonialism within Chicano studies. It complicates, I want to say, this idea of decoloniality and what that means in a very important way that encourages the use of it within in CCS studies to not just be an empty project. And then, of course, we see this probably most pointedly in Decolonial Border Queers and Mexico Profundo, with the examination of Chicanx groups who are underrepresented in the field and in scholarship. So some questions that I had, and I'll leave with you all because I'm like way beyond my time, and I apologize, is first, what makes Fanon's text core to considerations of colonialism? And again, thinking about even today, in our current political climates around the world. Do you agree with Tuck and Yang's assertion that decolonization must involve land back? And then lastly, what manifestations of colonization did the text we read not touch upon? Sorry, there's a typo there. And for me, just I'll throw out there one I have in mind, and I think who was it? Keanu starts to get at is this hoarding of resources. And here I'm thinking of non-renewable resources and environmental concerns that arise because of that. And those weren't necessarily touched upon in any of the readings that we read, at least explicitly. So that would be something else. Okay, thanks so much for watching, everybody. And I apologize, I went over time. I seriously didn't think I would even hit 15 minutes. So yeah.